Well, welcome back to Face the Nation on this cold Sunday, and joining us now for us from analysis, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. Peggy Noonan, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, David Sanger, the national security correspondent for the New York Times, and our own CBS News political director, John Dickerson. John, Harry Reid came out both barrels blazing this morning. If anybody was talking about a new attitude in Congress, I didn't really see that this morning.
That's right. He had one target, that was the Republicans in Congress. He must have said it 5 different times. He had his talking points ready. 2014 is not going to be a happy year. And why? Let's look at the Senate. Let's just look at the elections in the Senate. Okay. The Republicans need to take 6 seats to take Harry Reid's job away from him. In 7 of the seats where Democrats are in danger, they are in states where Mitt Romney won the election. We've seen over the last 20 years a correlation between if voters in a state vote for a Republican president, they're likely to vote for a Republican senator. And so Democrats have a tough year with the elections. And so Harry Reid begins a tough election year, starting with tough words about Republicans.
Does the rollout of Obamacare make it tougher for these Democrats? I asked Harry Reid the question, and he didn't really answer it. I said, are they going to be run as proud sponsors of Obamacare, or are they going to run away from it?
It does for a few reasons. One, it's just a distraction. Every minute a Democrat is talking about Obamacare, it's not a minute they can be talking about unemployment insurance extensions, minimum wage, or whatever else it is that they want to be talking about. So that's just at a basic level, Democrats are on their heels a little bit. Also, it riles up Republican voters. In midterm elections, the people who vote tend to be your base voters, and the people who tend to vote, there's only been one election since 1958 in which the president's party gained seats. Why is that? Because the party that's out of power in the White House is more riled up. Well, the Affordable Care Act riles up those Republicans. And in those tough races, which are all in red states, those are riled up Republicans with an issue that they don't like, the Affordable Care Act, and every Republican I talk to in the House and the Senate says this is what we're going to be talking about this year, not only on the stump, but in oversight hearings in the House and in every opportunity they can find.
Let me go to Peggy. Republicans, a lot of people thought Republicans had really hurt themselves when they led the drive to shut down the government in 2013. The publicity about the rollout of Obamacare kind of blunted that to some extent. But do you think we'll now see a battle over the debt ceiling to let the government default on the bills that for things money they've already spent? Because as you heard Harry Reid this morning, he doesn't seem in a mood to put anything, make any kind of compromises on that, or do anything to get Republican votes to
There's a little jujitsu going on there. He thinks a government shutdown would be really terrible. I think he would love it. It would not be good. Yeah, it would not be good for the Republicans, and I think they would try hard, actually, to see that didn't happen. But I thought the big thing about the Reid interview is that it was not full of reaching out and comity and we can do this together with the Republicans. It was those bad Republicans and that terrible, historically bad Tea Party. So I consider that quite suggestive of maybe a bit of a freeze in 2014.
You're nodding your head, David.
I feel the same way that Peggy does. Last year ended with scenes of comedy and bipartisanship. You had Paul Ryan and Patty Murray put together a budget deal that blunted the effects of sequestration. You had John Boehner declare his independence from the Tea Party in an amazing press conference, said they've lost all credibility. And you wouldn't have been crazy to think that this year would begin with someone like Harry Reid offering a more gentle tone and sort of reaching out to Boehner, saying Boehner's come some distance. And what was surprising this morning was that rather than try to see if legislating, which appears to be popular with the public, might be a strategy, I heard Harry Reid saying, no, it's going to be more of the same polarized by partisan politics, and I'm surprised.
Well, David, I mean, you cover foreign policy, you cover national security and things like that. Just step back from this interview this morning, and how did you take it?
Well, I thought there were 2 interesting things across the 3 interviews you had. The first was you didn't hear a broad vision from any of the 3 who you interviewed for an American resurgence out of this. And For President Obama, I think that's troublesome because Obamacare has really led to the question, can these guys execute the way that President Obama had really promised when he came to office first in 2009? And I think that was the most harmful part of Obamacare. But the second thing that President Obama and I think Harry Reid and the other Democrats who are leading the party tried to grab in 2009 was a vision of where the country was going. And you heard a very down in the weeds, what kind of advance can we make as far as February and getting past the next budget hurdle. And I'm not sure right now heading into elections that's really their best strategy, because you see a hunger for the question of American resurgence and then the question of whether or not the U.S. is leaving a power vacuum around the world in many of the places we're seeing erupt.
In a domestic context, I think the larger argument Democrats want to try to make is that we are the party that cares about you. That's what minimum wage is about. That's what extending unemployment benefits is about. And we care about you, and we're working hard for these things, and those mean Republicans don't. In the middle of the Affordable Care Act's launchpad disaster, when it launched so poorly, when the website wasn't working, talking to Democrats both in the House and the Senate, they said, we need a new fight. We need a budget fight, because budgets are about priorities. And even if it's a little issue like a minimum wage, that's a priority. It's a question of, are you for the little guy or are you for the companies? And that's a fight where Democrats are comfortable. It's part of their long-time hymnal that they can all sing together, as opposed to Affordable Care Act, where they're kind of fighting a little bit with each other. And so their larger national narrative for domestic politics, which they think is going to rule in these elections, is going to be about who cares about you. And they'll find every little tiny thing to make that argument, and that's what the fight about the minimum wage and unemployment benefits, that's what that'll be
Well,
about.
the president is talking about income inequality. I mean, we get word from Hawaii that that's what he's coming back to Washington to talk about. What does that mean to you, Peggy?
What it means to me is that he does not want to talk about Obamacare. It is widely assumed that in 2014, the bad news of Obamacare, the dislocations, the lost coverage, the price hikes, the premium hikes, et cetera, that all of this will continue. It's not the website. The website's the old story. It is the program. It will unveil over the next 2 years, and it's going to be problematic. The president does not want to talk about it. The Democrats do not want to talk about it. Therefore, income equality, minimum wage, et cetera, they need to change the subject.
David, how did this go so wrong? I mean, when you stop and think about it, I mean, the fact that people ought to have health insurance, and if poor people can't afford it, they ought to be able to get some relief on that. I mean, that would seem to be kind of a universal
and indeed
truth to me, and yet this thing
America
is the most tangled up. I've never seen anything quite like the way this
historians
thing is unfolded.
will write memorable books about how this got so messed up, how the president left the details to people who couldn't execute them is the biggest mystery of all.
It really is.
There was a consensus back in 2008 that something needed to be done about the delivery of healthcare services. It cost too much. What we monkeyed with instead is how healthcare is financed, which I think was a mistake. And I think you look back on the debate in 2009, the president really didn't have the votes. He had to jam it through with some sort of legislative maneuvers because the Congress wasn't quite ready and the country wasn't quite ready. So we're living with the after effects of that now. Thinking about this year ahead, the election of a new mayor in New York, very liberal, replacing the defining figure of centrism and moderation, Mayor Bloomberg. I wonder whether this is going to be a year in which these liberal themes, even Obamacare, but minimum wage, income inequality will move to the front for Democrats and for the country.
Well, the president's got an opportunity in that regard because he ended the year with the stock market at an incredible high, and with this termination of some of the unemployment benefits. And that's quite a division that the president can sort of run through when he gets to the State of the Union. Now, whether or not he manages to do that without further polarizing an already polarized system, that's the hard question.
That's right, because income inequality is a real big issue. It's not like he's off finding some phony little side issue. What'll be interesting, though, is what the solution is. If Republicans and Democrats can roughly agree that inequality is a problem, the question is, how do you fix it? And one interesting figure is in the course of healthcare and the fight over affordable healthcare, now Gallup says that 56% of the country doesn't believe everybody should have insurance. That used to be a majority opinion. So the question is, if everybody thinks inequality is a problem, how does, once we get through this big fight, who wins the argument of what the solution is, and does that warp and change the way people think about inequality? Because people do feel like things have gotten out of whack. The question is, the president will be framing it one way, Republicans will be saying, well, this is about jobs.
The funny thing about inequality is it's as if everybody has just discovered this problem of the rich are really rich and the poor are really poor, and the middle is
but
not gaining.
The argument, though, is that they're getting more so. The
Yes,
rich are getting a lot richer.
And normally this administration used to brag about how well the stock market was going, and in a way it's almost the negative side of one argument. But the answers so far to inequality is being presented now, even in New York. Brand new mayor, progressive, lefty, former Sandinista. What he's saying essentially is the old answer.
Former Sandinista? No, I didn't know that
Sorry,
part.
former, I beg your pardon, that is not true. Former enthusiast for Sandinista-like political movement in Nicaragua. But what he's saying essentially is the old playbook, not the new playbook. The old playbook is inequality, I will raise your taxes, and I will raise spending. Well, there's nothing revolutionary about that. That's the old playbook.
I think that's why the Obama people are so nervous and are saying on unemployment and minimum wage, it has economic growth benefits. You hear them talk a lot about the number of jobs and the GDP effects. That's all about saying this is about growth, business, and shrinking the deficit. It's not about redistribution and those old arguments.
Let's take a little break here, and we'll come back and talk. I want to talk about the United States overseas and what's going on there when we come back. Well, we're back now with our panel, and I want to talk to David Sanger a little bit about this. You know, I thought one of the saddest pieces of news last week was what's happening in Iraq now. We're in Fallujah. This is a place, Anbar province, where 1/3 of the Americans who were killed in the Iraq War lost their lives in that province. It now looks like it's in the hands of anti-government forces, if not, will soon be. What's happened there?
It is. What's happened here is that as America left Iraq and as it's leaving Afghanistan, and as many perceive the U.S. to be pulling back some from the Middle East, something I think a contention that John Kerry would argue with, as he's there now, you have seen a power vacuum develop. And power vacuums get filled in that region by extremist groups. And in this case, the extremist group is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which is basically an al-Qaeda Sunni affiliate that wants to not only take back Ramadi and Fallujah, but erase the barrier, erase the border between Iraq and Syria, make the Syrian conflict into a transnational one. The big question is, what could President Obama have done differently? Okay, so we went into Iraq with the concept that we would somehow change the state, and I think we've all concluded that there was a fair bit of hubris to that. But when President Obama came out, his view was that a light footprint strategy could keep fighting back against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And I think what we're seeing now, Bob, is that the light footprint, which was basically the use of special forces, of drones, of cyber, these weapons that don't involve Americans to go in on the ground very much or stay very long, that's running out of gas.
Well, David, what happens now? What can we do? What should we do?
Well, some group of people is going to have to take on al-Qaeda in the Euphrates Valley, in Syria and Iraq both. And the danger is that we've had a coalescence of al-Qaeda forces. That's being done now by the Maliki government, the Shiite-led, Iranian-backed Maliki government in Baghdad. In Syria, it's being done to the extent it's being done at all by the government of President Bashar al-Assad and elements of the opposition we've been trying to back. I mean, while I understand David's point about the big Spenglerian themes of American decline, as I look at this story, I see little mistakes. It wasn't inevitable or essential that people would stop paying the sons of Iraq, the tribal fighters in Fallujah, which was just overwhelmed this week, in Ramadi, in these cities, to stand up against al-Qaeda. That was happened because Maliki let it happen, and we basically acquiesced. Same thing in Syria. Secretary Clinton, General Petraeus, Secretary Panetta, all of our top national security officials said in mid-2012, we've got to get started backing rebels who can suppress al-Qaeda. We're going to have a huge problem. The president decided not to do it. It wasn't a huge mistake. It was a small mistake. But today, that's what we're living with. And there's going to be a new war against al-Qaeda in that part of the world. That's coming.
Well, I mean, will the United States go back to Iraq?
Not in the, as David said, not in the large footprint way, but we are already providing. Iraq's the only country in the world asking for NSA surveillance technology. We are providing every kind of tool we can give them to help them go after al-Qaeda, find out who they are and go after them.
Will that be enough, David?
That's the big question, because every time that President Obama has chosen this method of trying a small arms shipments, whether it's in Syria or whether it's in Iraq, it's proven not to be up to the job. And the problem that he faces right now is that in President Maliki in Iraq, he has allied himself, or has found himself stuck with, somebody who has not been willing to make any kind of compromise or concession. And so that's opened up this Sunni-Shia divide. In Afghanistan, we haven't done a whole lot better with President Karzai. And I think the big question is, if you don't have leaders on the ground who you can trust to take this on and do it in a smart way, what do you do short of re-engaging? And I'm in complete agreement with David. There is no way that President Obama is going to send back American forces on the ground into places that he staked his presidency on coming out of.
And that's particularly true of a year where one of the bright spots he hopes for him is being able to celebrate the return of troops from Afghanistan. Even though some are staying, 7,000 to 10,000, he's going to champion the fact that 40-some thousand are coming back, and that's a promise fulfilled from his original
do we in
campaign.
fact know? I mean, is the Afghan government going to sign off on the agreements that will allow us to keep 7,000 there? Because I can't imagine we're going to keep American troops there if they are subject to being arrested and prosecuted by Afghan forces if the Afghans somehow say they've committed some sort of crime. And that's one of the issues here. We'll not put our troops in that position. Would we, Dave?
We would not, and my guess is that this will be finessed. I think that the position the U.S. is taking is the agreement is signed, Karzai is going to go along with it, and he will get pushed from every political direction. Afghans do not want to, for the most part, do not want to see the U.S. Leaving. They know what's ahead, which is another civil war.
Peggy?
It all feels sad and repetitive, and I think once again we go back, or we will go back, to debating the question, what is in America's strategic interests in this part of the world as it struggles through the mess it is in? Second question, as I keep wondering, is this going to, what's going on in Iraq and Syria, spill over into Lebanon, which would be very tragic.
It already has.
Well,
sadly.
I mean, in a big way.
Yeah.
That would be really something.
David, let me just, if I could shift quickly, because I meant to ask you this earlier and I forgot. The New York Times, really, you're a newspaper, and you're responsible for everything in there. That's why we have you here today. Your newspaper said that Edward Snowden should somehow be given some sort of amnesty, and they called him a whistleblower, not a traitor. What's going on here?
This was in an editorial in the Times, yes. And as you point out, I'm on the news side, not the editorial side. But I thought the editorial was interesting because both the Times and the Guardian in Britain came out to basically the same position, which was that the United States should either offer an amnesty or some kind of deal to get Snowden back. What I found particularly interesting is that it was echoing something that had been said on 60 Minutes by the man at the NSA who's been trying to track down what it was that Snowden left with. And he was raising the possibility, which his boss immediately shot down, that Snowden might be offered a deal so that you could recover what it is that he has stolen. I'm not sure at this point it's recoverable because we don't know where all the copies of it are. What I find interesting is that inside the White House, there is absolutely no appetite for this at all. Their view is Snowden broke the law, broke his own agreements, and there will be no deal.
Do you think, John, that the president will, though, call for the National Security Agency to be reined in some way?
He will. He will. It was interesting in his press conference at the end of the year that he said, the balance has been struck, and I'm confident, and there's been no abuses. But, and then he said, because of the Snowden releases and people's worries about this, reforms need to be put in place. And so two that are being considered is, one, having all of this metadata, the phone numbers, the tracking, be held by a third party, not by the government. And the other is having some kind of an advocate. So if all of the information is in a box somewhere with a key, that you have a tougher process for getting the key to get into the box, and that those are some safeguards to make sure this isn't abused, but the president's not going to admit that it's abused. What'll be interesting in his speech is whether he tries to make a larger strategic argument about where we are more than 10 years after 9/11.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you. We'll be back with a look back at one of the most notorious guests ever to appear in the 60 years of Face the Nation.